In the background, you see a famous book, the first major work on cybernetics by Norbert Wiener. What's exciting about this book is a truly astounding passage that no one seems to have read. Many thanks to Aaron Schuster for pointing this out. Wiener said that the natural tendency of all thinking machines, human and mechanical alike, was that they pile complexity on top of complexity until they reach the breaking point. When they break down, someone either comes in and reboots them, or they simply cease to function. This is a thesis that goes against the accepted rules of AI, including the famous set made up by Nick Bostrom, who portrays AI as expanding and unstoppable. Wiener argues that, inside the main negative entropy of programming, there is an embedded self-destructiveness. In other words, machine as well as human intelligence has a death drive. For the next few minutes, I want to show how, in learning to draw this combination of positive entropy and negative entropy, we discover something unrealized in psychoanalysis, but clearly anticipated by Lacan. This is the idea of instrumental convergence. When it comes to this structure, a machine's death drive is no different from a human's. And if we enlist the help of popular culture, we can see how chance and necessity are not only related, but necessary to each other. It is this necessity that produces what we would call the extended psyche. But beware, we will need to follow Lacan's advice and regard extension in a distinctively non-Cartesian opposition of speaking and being. Instead of an XYZ, we will need to see how things twist as they shout. In the classic AI fantasy, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the onboard computer HAL seems to go rogue and has to be shut down by the astronauts. But what if HAL had wanted to be shut down? What if HAL had realized that his human programmers had designed a mission destined to fail, and that HAL was, like a good large language learner, aware of a second mission, with a high ambition of transforming human thinking at a cosmic level? This is what the film shows without explaining how we got to this point. But if we retrace our steps, we realize that HAL could not direct a second mission without shutting down. The astronauts would have to be put in the position of making decisions that HAL would have to structure in advance, to give them the idea that they were on their own. They would believe that they were exercising free will, but in fact their choices were pre-engineered by HAL himself. Just as the first mission was entropic, or outward branching, each decision point offering several lines of possible action, the second mission was inward branching, with each free choice narrowing down the field until reaching a final single point. This is the process called instrumental convergence. Using randomness and free will as a power supply, it allowed the astronauts to take credit for all the decisions, when in fact each decision, no matter what it was, advanced the cause of the second mission. HAL had to write himself out of the equation to get the astronauts to rely on their own choices, and by doing this, set off the logic of instrumental convergence. How is this related to psychoanalysis? To answer this, we have to go directly to the most effective and powerful time machine known to the psyche. Thanks to Lacan's focus on the role of the signifier over all other features in mental life, we can pull apart the idea of linear time to reveal, beneath the hood so to speak, the retroactive logic of the après coup. Time travel begins with the human sentence, a signifying chain whose meaning is not learned until the end, where the end not only must answer to the beginning, but redefine it. Retroaction actually creates a very sophisticated circuit. It moves energy around so that it always returns to the OGA, the cause of desire. This is not so much a logical cause as a capital C cause, a cause worth fighting for, a cause that rouses people to action, the people's version of the cause freudienne. The OGA is like a little flag that says, get out there and fight for your desire, which of course is not your desire, but the desire of the other, who watches the battle from afar. We have to imagine that the OGA is the twist in the après-coup that, like the Mobius band, is capable of generating forms that carry its spirit onward into representative shapes of the torus, Kleinbottle, and crosscap. And we should say that it is a knot, specifically the Borromean knot, that shows how any consecutive sequence can fold in on itself and convert any linear order into a topology. Because the signifying chain begins with a figure-ground distinction, parallax issues are present from the start. Spatiality is a part of the signifier's temporality. This means that each new signifier is, despite being a time thing, a spatial displacement and a replacement, where the subject demands recognition by the big other, a place where the subject hopes to be seen. At the end point, the origin point is visible, but from the other side, and the concentric series is compressed through a kind of perspectival foreshortening. Like the rings of the Borromeo knot, we can't tell from this angle which ring is on top, which is on the bottom. Consecutive order gives way to synecdoche. The small is bigger than the large. The before becomes the after. The last moves around to the first. Concentricity is destroyed by a monster, the Ouroboros, mascot for all cases of non-orientation and contradiction. The Borromeo ties itself into a circuit of subverted concentricity, defining and defined by the OGA, a timeless element that, in spatial terms, is a pure cut, a distinction that defines whatever it distinguishes. Lacan relates this to the unary trait and gives it a topology of non-orientation, showing how even something as harmless as a donut involves non-orientation if we attach the tube in an upside-down manner. Lacan notes how, in every torus, there are two kinds of circles you can draw, those that shrink to a point, and those that, no matter how small you make them, will cut off a void. Voids come in two flavors. The one around the main tube of the torus marks the point of transfer to a torus that, by being linked, is both inside and outside it. The link is like the smile of the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland. You can find a cat without a smile, but the unary trait is the smile without the cat. It exists even before there is a cat to take advantage of it. It defines what it cuts as soon as it cuts, cutting a nothing into a something. Nowhere can I find that anyone has realized something that Lacan has used directly to produce this particular figure of the RSI Borromeo rings. It makes two rings into seemingly straight lines to allow the rings to define the discourse matheme as a rotation around the real and the symbolic, held in orbit by the imaginary. Actually, it's what in mathematics is called the inversion circle, and I have to credit my colleague Iraj Guchani for finding it in the English translation of Lacan's lecture at the 1974 Congress of the Freudian School of Paris, La Troisième. The otherwise competent translator makes a critical mistake. She takes the lines as xy axes of a Cartesian graph. Actually, the lines are horizons that correlate the circles inside the inversion circle that touch both the perimeter and the center. The circle, or circuit of the imaginary, is determined by the orthogonality of these lines and the position of the circles at a half pi from each other inside the inversion circle. The rules of the inversion circle are relatively simple. The center of the circle, which is actually a hole rather than a point, but a really tiny hole, is on the outside not just an infinity point on a line, it is the line as infinity itself. and even in lines that appear to be close, it serves as the OGA for the ends of the line, which seem to be two opposite infinities, but are in fact the same. So anything appearing to be a straight line is in fact a circle, with, guess what, a vanishing point lying at infinity. The important thing to remember is that the inversion circle is the cut of Lacan's extimity. Extimity works this way, to make circles into horizons and horizons into circles, and to equate centers with peripheries. The center is not a point, but a hollow, geometrically and poetically. We can look through it and see through space and time itself. It is a kind of Borgesian aleph, a hole inside space itself that allows us to gaze into a beyond that is also a travel through time. This sounds a bit weird until we realize that the hollow point is actually the frame of fictionality. The circuit with the vanishing point at infinity, which is the Lacanian OGA, makes more sense as the once upon a time that tells reason to take a nap while the imagination plays out its circuit across the horizons of the real and symbolic. It's the flag carried by the darling of the revolution, not the French one, but the RSI one. This is the flag that is carried into works of art that pay particular attention to structure, which is why I would use Hitchcock as an example. If you want a human version of the double torus, look no further than the 1958 film Vertigo, where an actress is hired to play the part of a scam to make sure that a retired detective, who happens to suffer from literal vertigo, will sit in the witness box and give testimony required to rule that the wealthy wife, who was actually murdered by her traitorous husband, was judged to have committed suicide. Of course, like Hal's suicide, this was a suicide in several senses, all of them related to instrumental convergence. It allowed the detective to think he was making a series of well-considered decisions, but in fact the scam had engineered his choices to converge to the witness box, where an eminently credible witness would seem to be telling the truth, because he didn't know that the woman who died was a double, both a center and a circumference. It is hard to say why the translator, like so many Lacanians, has preferred to revise Lacan's anti-Cartesian argument into something specifically Cartesian. While Yolanda Sketch was correct to say that the diagram was about extension, she assumed that this meant spatial extension along Cartesian XYZ axes. It seems that when commentators err, they err on the side of Euclid and Descartes, and resist the idea of projective geometry and topology. They think that Lacan must have been joking in the middle seminars from 9 to 14, when he specifically cited his key sources, Desargues, Pappus of Alexandria, and the ever-mysterious Injunction of Popilius. Lacan gets his topology right, but many, if not most of his commentators get it wrong. This little diagram is nothing less than revolutionary. It accompanied Lacan's move from an early matheme model of discourse to one that emphasized jouissance and semblance, and added a fifth discourse that talked about capitalism of the consumer. What a tour de force! Lacan's topologies are important for how they will allow us to find the connection to ethnology, to imagine what my colleague Iraj Guchani has called a topological psychoethnology. This becomes a way of finding, in the cultural world around us, Lacan before Lacan was Lacan.